Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. We're very excited this evening to be listening to Rob speak about the final advance, Valciennes to Mons. Please feel free throughout the presentation to put any questions that you have in the chat box, and Rob would be pleased to answer them at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. What we're going to talk about today is the final series of battles in the last essential month of the First World War, and the Canadian advance from the very end of the Battle of Cambrai till the 11th of November, 1918, and the armistice. So, Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies, apps, or products named in this presentation, and they do not sponsor and are not sponsored and do not endorse any of the companies that I mentioned in this presentation. These are companies that I recommend because they're the ones I've used before or I've heard about from other guides. So what we're going to talk about today is a quick overview of the battle. We're going to talk about some recommended preparations, some travel advisories, visas, and security type things. Some helpful words, very important, especially on a First World War battlefield. Some must-try places to eat and some places to stay. Talk about transport, which is always important when you're maneuvering around a battlefield. We're going to talk about the Battle of, this is the wrong slide. We're going to talk about the Battle of Valciennes and the Battle of Mons and the liberation at the last month of the war. So where are we talking about? We're talking about France and Belgium. They're literally on the border. And we're talking about the Hauts de France and the Wallonia region of France. In both of those areas, they speak French. The main airports to get to this location, you can choose Charles de Gaulle, or you can use Brussels Zaventem airports. Both can get you there. Valciennes is first mentioned in 1693 and was known for its lace and textiles and then steel industries. Mons dates back to Roman times and has always been an industrial and university town. France and Belgium are the 11th and 12th most expensive countries to live in Europe, so they're kind of higher than the average. Cool facts, both were heavily fortified towns, but their defenses were torn down in the late 1800s, and subsequently they were both captured by the Germans in the opening battles in 1914, and were captured at the end of the war after some very fierce fighting. So, France and Belgium generally have mild climates with wet, cool winters and warm, dry summers. The best time to travel to this battlefield is really the end of April when it starts to get dry, till the middle of November when it starts to get very, very uncomfortably wet. A rain jacket is always a great idea when you're traveling the battlefields. It helps as a windbreaker because it can get quite windy. And you also need really good footwear because some of the places we're talking about are not going to be great paths. They'll be cobblestones. They will be cemeteries that can get quite muddy sometimes. Always travel with travel and medical insurance. It's always, you never know what's going to go wrong when you travel. All memorials and cemeteries are child friendly. Actually, the Belgians encourage children to go visit their cemeteries, and the CWGC does as well as an education piece. And most areas in the most places in the area are very child friendly. Sadly, there are no city passes for Valenciennes or Mons. So, travel advisors, always check the Government of Canada travel advice. It's important. There's no visa or entry requirements from EU countries, but there is a maximum 90-day stay from Canada. Security concerns, petty crime is always a risk, but generally Valciennes and Mons are quite safe, all things considered, but there's always a risk of terrorism in both countries, and as I said, there's always a risk of petty crime. There are hospitals both in Valciennes and in Mons. The emergency number for both countries is 112, and your two closest embassies, depending on which side of the border you're on, one is in Paris and the other is Brussels. So always dress for the weather. It's close to the sea, all things considered, so it can get quite chilly quite quickly. You never know when the weather's going to turn. Please don't climb on any of the monuments. That's exactly what they are. They're monuments to individuals, the fallen, or the units that fought there, and they're quite personal. And some will actually even have ashes spread around them in some cases. When you remember that you're visiting somebody's home, this is where they live and work, and to allow us to keep visiting all these places, please respect the property and the memorials, parking. The locals get very tired of people parking in their driveways. Be aware that many of the fields still contain war remains, and do not touch them. They're becoming more and more unstable as time passes. And I'll give you two examples on the slide. The top one is a bunker just outside of Arras, France. like literally in the farmer's field on the side of the road, and there's an artillery shell. The other one is actually on the Somme battlefield. That's my truck that I had to back up because I almost parked on it. So this is how common these are. My last visit to the battlefields, I was driving down the road and you could still see the paint on the shell, and it was an incendiary shell, which makes it even more dangerous. And those are the type of shells that are becoming more dangerous, these chemical and incendiary shells. So just be forewarned that they are there and they can be present. So some places to stay. If you're going to, places to eat. If you're going to eat in Valciennes, there's Le Bistrot de La Charles, and it's a great restaurant. It's highly recommended. It's right downtown, quite popular. Other guides have recommended it to me. If you're in Mons, there's Maxon's in Mons, which is actually near the Battle of Mons Memorial. There's Octobre in Mons, which is highly, highly recommended from one of my guide friends. And one of them mentioned Le Carillon in Mons has been recommended to him by a client who had stayed in Mons and ate there. So there's some great choices in restaurants in Mons and in Valciennes. Some places to stay. If you're staying in Valciennes, there's an Ibis. That Ibis Hotel in Valciennes is quite nice. It's actually not far from. It's actually close to a BC Action location. In fact, there's a memorial plaque there. We'll talk about later. That hotel is near that BC Action. There's a B&B hotel, which is rather convenient as well. If you're staying at Mons, Auberge de Jeunesse or Hotel St. George has come highly recommended. I've never stayed in Mons because it's only a couple of hours from home. So I usually am seeing it on my way back from a tour at the very end of a tour, and people are going their own way. So there are only traditional taxis in Valciennes and Mons. There's no Bolt or Uber. So there's that aspect. But if you're going to those towns, you're probably going to need a car anyways, because the locations are fairly far apart until you get into the cities themselves. Tour guides. There are many around, but I recommend the Gilded Battlefield Guides, which I'm a member of. They have an excellent selection of amazing First World War guides, or you can contact me at Woolsey's War Walks. I have a Facebook page, and I specialize in Canadian First World War and Second World War battlefields. Always a good idea. Have an international driver's license if you're going to be renting a car in Europe. A lot of countries don't require it, but many do. Italy, France, sometimes I've had where I've needed it and not needed it in France. So those are two another important note for driving around. So the final advance. This is the official history map from the Nicholson History published in 1964. And the great thing about these maps is that they are second to none when it comes to the level of details and the units. So as you can see, we start just outside the city of Mons, and then you can see the big push over the next 30 days. And after the pushing the Germans out of Cambrai at the beginning of October 1918, the Canadian Corps was actually moved to a quieter part of the front line just north of Cambrai along the Sensee Canal. The 1st Canadian Division did some minor operations, and it was discovered that the Germans were preparing to carry out a very large withdrawal from some of the prisoners that they had captured. The Allies attacked along the River Lys in Belgium on the 15th of October, which forced the Germans back, causing all the German armies in the front of Cambrai to also begin to pull back, this time to a new defensive line called the Herman Line, which ran from the village of Ecloo in Belgium all the way through Valenciennes in France. The 4th Canadian Division came back into the line on the 16th of October, with the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions ruining General Arthur Currie's preferred 2-in, 2-out scheme of maneuver. So with having 3 divisions on the front line, it didn't allow Currie to replace 1-for-1 divisions. So unfortunately, when the 4th Division came back into the line, he now had 3 of his 4 divisions deployed. On the 17th of October, the Germans began their retreat. And this was noticed when the daily morning artillery barrage of the 1st Canadian Division, who would carry out this shoot to test to see if there's any Germans still there. It was a daily routine. They would just do a shoot in and see if the Germans responded. And because on the 17th, it drew no retaliation, patrols were organized to go figure out what was going on and investigate. News came back to the Canadian Corps from the British 5th Army, which was north of the Canadian Corps, that the Germans were beginning to retreat on their front. And quickly, the 1st and 2nd Canadian Brigades were launched forward, crossing the Sensee Canal. The 1st Canadian Division made good progress, but the 2nd and 4th Divisions had more challenges as the Germans were pulling out in their area in a more deliberate fashion and the terrain was becoming more challenging. But by daybreak on the 18th of October, 1918, the Canadians had a bridgehead over the canal. The 1st and 4th Canadian Divisions gained some additional troops in the form of a squadron of the Canadian Light Horse, which was the Canadian Corps Cavalry Regiment, like a reconnaissance unit, a company from the Canadian Corps Cyclist Battalion, as well as 2 additional machine gun batteries and 2 armored cars, each to keep up the pursuit of the fleeing Germans. This essentially gave the Canadian divisions a very, very mobile force that could try to keep in contact with the Germans, and so that when the infantry came up, they'd have a clue of what was going on. There also proved to be a serious challenge for the Canadians in the terms of logistics, with the Germans having destroyed roads, railways, and bridges, plus the lengthening supply lines, and now civilian refugees that now needed to be looked after, fed, and dealt with, which was actually a first for the Canadian Corps. Of course, the weather decided that it was going to interfere, and it turned wet and cold, only adding to the tired and worn down soldiers' challenges. But as the advance continued, the towns became less and less damaged and destroyed, and the role of the advancing troops was not just to fight, but to liberate. So we're part of the battlefield that has not been fought over since 1914 in the initial battles. So this was going to be a completely different space for the Canadian soldiers. For the first time in 4 years, they are seeing actual villages and not just ruins. By the time the Canadians reached Valenciennes, they had freed some 70,000 French citizens from German occupation. A dozen towns were liberated on the 18th of October alone, 40 more on the 19th, during a 12,000-yard or 10-kilometer advance that day, which happened to be the longest single advance by the Canadians to date in the war. The advance of all British units pushing forward allowed the Canadians to finally shorten their lines and pull the 2nd Canadian Division out of the front line and into reserve on the 20th of October, 1918, giving Currie his 2 in, 2 out. The 21st of October saw some tough fighting by the 1st Division around the town of Wallers, and then finally were moved out after being continuously in the front line since just before the Battle of the Canal du Nord. It's being taken by the 3rd Canadian Division under Major General Frederick Loomis, who has fought for every single battle since the beginning of the war to the end. He started the war as Lieutenant Colonel Battalion Commander at the Second Battle of Ypres. And by the 23rd of October, the Canadian Corps took a pause to allow the corps on either side of it to catch up, as well as to prepare for its attack on the town of Valciennes. There were patrols put across the Escaut, or Scheldt Canal, the barrier that the Canadians had decided to stop at on the 23rd, to try to establish a bridgehead. There was also one other constraint put on the Canadians at this point, which was that they were not allowed to do a large-scale bombardment of the city. This was not allowed because of the risk to the large number of civilians that still lived in the city. The pause also allowed the Canadians to repair the roads and bridges and the movement of supplies to come forward to prepare for the next set of attacks. The Battle of Valciennes. These 2 maps are interesting. One gives you the push of the armies, and it's quite clear. It also gives you where the attacks were coming from Valciennes, and the other is a blow-up of the official history map. It's a little bit harder to see because of the coloring, but it gives you a really good idea of what we're facing and what we're going to be going into. The Battle of Valciennes from the 1st to the 2nd of November, 1918. The German selection of Valciennes as part of the Hermann Line was very intentional. The Escaut Canal formed a natural barrier to the north and west, and the houses and the buildings were what we call loopholes, so holes punched through the walls to form natural fortifications. The town was heavily wired, and the Germans opened up the sluice gates and opened up holes in the dikes, flooding the areas surrounding the town. There was also a high feature named Mount Huy, which was about 150 feet higher than the canal and south of the town, which was also heavily fortified. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie and Lieutenant General Godley, the commander of the British 22nd Corps, who was just south of the Canadians, gathered to discuss how they were going to take Valenciennes on the 27th of October. The key was to capture Mount Huy, and in order to make the defending the city harder and to force the Germans to retreat once again. And this might sound very familiar if you've heard me talk about Hill 70, Currie used Hill 70 instead of taking Lens. He forced the Germans. He realized that the hill was the important part. In this case, to take Valciennes, this Mount Huy was the most important ground to take. The plan initially called for the British 51st Highland Division to attack and then take Mount Huy on the 28th of October, and then have the 4th Canadian Division come through them to capture the southern outskirts of the city, and then on the 1st of November to take the high ground east of the city, outflanking it and allowing other parts of the Canadian Corps to cross to the west. The attack by the 51st Highland Division began at 5:15 a.m. on the 28th, and while they did capture the Mount, they lost it in the German counterattack and only held on to its southern slopes. And the plan released by the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade under the command of Brigadier Hayter on the night of the 28th, 29th was cancelled. And the beat up and tired Highlanders held on to their gains until the next day, when they were replaced by the British 49th West Riding Division, and on the right-hand side of their positions, and the 10th Canadian Brigade on the left. The plans to take Mount Huy and Valenciennes were now changed to meet a new offensive that was planned to start on the 3rd of November. The attack on the 3rd of November was going to involve 3 British armies attacking at the same time across the entire front. And now, because of this, a single attack with a now massive fire plan with the 10th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Ross, now as of the 28th of October, attacking from the south. And the 12th Canadian Brigade, under command of Brigadier McBrien, who later became the chief of the defense staff between the wars, from the west, was going to start on the 1st of November. The artillery plan called for specific German locations to be heavily hit. The steelworks at Marly, for example, but the city was to generally be spared. Mount Huy was also to be heavily hit, and a smokescreen laid and a machine gun barrage into the city to suppress the Germans and to cover the attack. At 5:15 again, with no preliminary bombardment, the 44th and 47th Battalions of the 10th Canadian Brigade attacked behind a quickly fired creeping barrage. The 44th easily took Mount Huy, and the 47th took all of their objectives, all by 6:30 in the morning, in capturing a great many prisoners. The 46th Battalion leapfrogged the 44th, and with the 47th, by 10:20 in the morning, were on the outskirts of the city of Valciennes itself. The Germans at Marly steelwork put up a fierce resistance, and the 50th Battalion was brought forward to help the 46th Battalion contain the Germans there. The last Canadian Victoria Cross action of the war happened on the 1st of November, when Sergeant Hugh Cairns of the 46th Northwest Battalion, otherwise known as the Suicide Battalion, and that's what its official history is actually called, grabbed a Lewis gun and rushed a German strongpoint alone, killing its occupants and capturing the machine gun. He repeated this action, accounting for 30 more Germans, and 2 more machine guns. A third action had him wounded as he led the capture of another outpost and its machine gun and a couple of field artillery pieces. He was severely wounded later on in the mopping up of Marly when he was disarming a group of Germans his patrol had just captured, and he died the next day of his wounds. Today, he is commemorated at Auberchicourt British Cemetery. The attack continued with the 12th Canadian Brigade crossing the Escaut Canal, and by noon, the 38th Ottawa and the 72nd Seaforth Battalions had already crossed and were into the heart of the city. While they had not fully taken it, by the end of the day, they had captured 1,800 prisoners, killed 800, at a cost of only 80 killed and 300 wounded. 2,149 tons of shells were fired from the 31st of October to the 2nd of November in helping capture the city. And one of the reasons they were able to capture it with so little prisoners is because the targeted barrage of those 2,100 shells, or tons of artillery fire, completely saturated the Germans, and literally every report count I've read has the German prisoners being constantly dazed by the weight of fire. On the night of the 2nd November, the 11th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Victor Odom replaced the 10th Brigade and then attacked Marly, only to find that the Germans had withdrawn and continued to push their way through the rest of the city, and by the end of the day were in its eastern outskirts. The 3rd Division had crossed the Escaut Canal north of Valciennes, and by the end of the 2nd of November had come up in line with the 4th Canadian Division. The attack by the 3 armies for the 3rd of November was postponed because the Germans were in such a large retreat, leaving only light rear guards. Instead, a general advance was ordered, with the Canadian Corps being told to push towards Mons. Thus, ended the last major battle for the Canadian Corps. Battle of Valciennes. Now, some of these look staged. These are the top right-hand photo is supposedly the very first Canadian platoon entering Valciennes from the west, advancing towards the canal. The one beside it is some Canadians going over an improvised bridge in the battle. The bottom right-hand side is the 1st Canadian Patrol actually entering from the west again after they've crossed the bridge, and this is them moving down the street. And the last photo is the Canadian Artillery Unit moving past the entrance of the station of Valciennes just at the end of the battle. So these are all from Library and Archives Canada. They're official photos. Of course, some of them are very much deliberately staged because the photographer was not likely to be that far forward in the action or in front of advancing infantry. But they are from the time period. So where can I visit today? Well, this is always a very fun time. So you can visit Valciennes Saint-Roch Communal Cemetery. There's 147 known Canadians in this cemetery, and they're going to be mostly the casualties from this battle. Also, there's the Sergeant Hugh Cairns VC commemorative plaque. It's at the location where the VC action took place, or one of the parts of the VC action took place. He did do 3 actions. You can also visit Illinois Communal Cemetery. There's 121 known Canadians in there. And there's also the Denain Communal Cemetery with 68 known Canadians. So those are all different locations that you can visit. And it's important to visit them because not all of these cemeteries get visited because most people don't know that Canada actually fought at Valciennes, which is kind of important. The Battle of Mons, the 11th of November, 1918. This is actually the second Battle of Mons. I have to preface this because the first Battle of Mons was the very opening battle for the British Empire in the First World War. So it's very fitting that we are fighting in Mons on the very last day of the war. The second Battle of Mons came about a week after the advancing Canadians covered, and it covered an entirely new type of terrain. Gone were the open fields and slight rolling hills and streams. They were now replaced by deep valleys with faster flowing rivers and thick forests. It's a defender's paradise, but in this case, from Verdun to the sea, the Germans were in complete retreat. The advance was not paced by the Germans, but by the logistics and supporting the Canadians' advance, as the roads were, in official terms, in miserable condition, and those that were paved were only capable of one-way traffic. The roads were narrow. The roads were in poor shape, and the Germans were doing their best to slow down anything that they could happen. The weather also turned even wetter and worse than before, making it even more challenging and destroying the roads even faster. But the Canadian Corps crossed the Belgian frontier on the 7th of November, led by the 3rd Canadian Division. At this time, there were negotiations for an armistice, and it was going on this entire time, but the advance was ordered to continue because no one knew what was going to happen. And as the advance continued, and by the evening of the 9th of November, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, who had been in the vanguard for the last few days, were replaced by the Royal Canadian Regiment in the suburb town of Jemappes. The plan was for the Royal Canadian Regiment to attack Mons from the north, west, and south with different companies, but a heavy mist and strong German fire from the town on the morning of the 10th of November meant that the decision was taken to add the 42nd Black Watch Battalion to the attack at 8:30 in the morning. They spent the rest of the day working their way into the city very unsuccessfully. The 4th Division, in the meantime, had been replaced by the 2nd Canadian Division, who had been in reserve, and who struck south of Mons and captured to within 3 miles of the town. By 10 p.m. on the night of November 11th, 1918, the Canadian Corps issued its new orders for the capture of Mons. The 2nd Canadian Division's 19th Battalion continued to attack and took the village of Hoyan, and by 3:15 in the morning on the 11th of November, had taken a very strongly held wood nearby. At 8 a.m. on the 11th, the 4th Canadian Brigade was across the Mons-Grevy Road at the village of Saint-Semprin on the Mons-Charleroi Road. The 3rd Canadian Division was to continue its attack into Mons, and the task fell to the 7th Canadian Brigade's Royal Canadian Regiment and 42nd Battalions. They had to cross the old moats of Mons, the Canal du Centre, and another tributary whose approaches the Germans had covered with machine guns. At 10 p.m. on the 10th of November, the 42nd Battalion stomped across the rail yards and entered the city and began to clear eastwards. A second company attack, this time a mix of Royal Canadian Regiment and 42nd Black Watch men, crossed the old moat and began to move north through the city. And another RCR company attacked from the northwest, beginning at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of November. The fourth entry was made by the last company of the RCR, which cleared even more suburbs. This has now developed a bit of a controversy of which unit actually reached the center of the town of Mons first. What's more interesting about this is that the two units involved, the Royal Canadian Regiment and the 42nd Black Watch, both claimed that they got there first. The Royal Canadian Regiment was given the honor of saying they actually took it first, which is interesting because the divisional commander, Major General Loomis, was a member of the Black Watch. So take that for what that is. But by daybreak on the 11th of November, the town of Mons had actually been liberated. The 42nd Battalion pipes and drums marched through the city at 7 a.m., and we're going to see some photos of that. And by 11 a.m., the 3rd Canadian Division had pushed 5 miles past the edge of the town of Mons. At 6:30 in the morning, though, the message made it to Canadian Corps headquarters that there would actually be an armistice, and it would go into effect at 11 a.m. that morning. And it was rapidly sent down the line, but the frontline battalions only found out by about 9 o'clock in the morning. Losses on the 10th, 11th November 1918 for the Canadians are disputed, with many numbers being given, but the number given after a big investigation triggered by Arthur Currie because of a lawsuit launched against him into the casualties that day revealed that there was only 1 soldier killed and 15 wounded. Many more died of wounds that day, but at different locations, and not all those wounds were sustained on the 11th of November. The one man that was killed was Private George Lawrence Price of A Company, 28th Northwest Battalion of the 6th Canadian Brigade, 2nd Canadian Division, who was shot and killed by a sniper at the village of Havre minutes before the armistice came into effect, making him the very last British Empire soldier to fall in the entire war. Today, he's commemorated at Saint-Sophrin Military Cemetery, and he is not far from from the very first British soldier who fell in the war, Private John Parr of the Middlesex Regiment. And he's also close to Private George Edwin Ellison of the 5th Royal Lancers, who was the last British soldier to fall in the First World War. And what makes this actually kind of more even tragic is that Ellison had fought through the entire war. He was a old regular from the very first Battle of Mons until he was killed by a sniper at 9:30 in the morning on the 11th of November, 1918. The armistice went into effect mere minutes after Price was killed on the 11th of November, and the war ended where it had begun, at Mons. So it's important in this picture, as you see the Battle of Mons is blown up, and literally they came in from different sides, penetrating through, driving towards the center. There's 2 photos from a photo album that was in the National Archives. The first is some troops on our main Grand Place in Mons on the 11th of 1918. They are 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade. I do not know if it's not a but again, out for inspection on the 11th of November, just after the armistice came into effect. So those are Canadian soldiers in the top left-hand corner marching through the streets of Mons the morning of the 11th, sometime between when the town was liberated and about 9 o'clock in the morning is what the archives has figured. Right beside it is the 42nd Battalion resting on the Grand Place in Mons on the morning of the 11th of November 1918. There's no photos of the Royal Canadian Regiment, but there's a lot of photos of the Black Watch. So the fact that the RCR got the title of they liberated Mons, I can appreciate that might cause some friction for Black Watch soldiers. On the easternmost outpost of the British Western Front held by the Canadians east of Mons on November 1918, there's a battery of machine guns belonging to the 3rd Battalion Canadian Machine Gun Corps, which supported the 3rd Division. And that's them at their farthest point that they reached on November the 11th. And the bottom is General Sir Arthur Currie, the Canadian Corps Commander, Major General Frederick Loomis, commander of the 3rd Canadian Divisions, and many of the officers in the Grand Place in Mons on November 11th, 1918, taking a marching salute, taking the march past by troops of the 3rd Canadian Division right at the end of the war. So those are actually 42nd, the top right-hand corner, I should also point out, is 42nd Battalion pipes and drums marching the battalion through town. So where do you visit when you go to the Battle of Mons? Well, for me, one of the most important places to visit is the Grand Place in Mons, because you can actually be where the Canadian Corps literally ended the war, which is pretty spectacular if you ask me. It's very obvious it's marked, and you can look at photos of the period and stand exactly where some of these people were. You should also visit Mons Bergen Communal Cemetery. There's 57 Canadians that died that are commemorated there. It's one of the cemeteries I actually haven't been to, unfortunately, but it is an absolutely gorgeous cemetery. There are Belgian soldiers there. There are French soldiers. There are British Commonwealth soldiers there. Also, as going towards Saint-Cyprien, there is the Battle of Mons Monument. It's actually the Battle of Mons Monument to both battles. There's always a British, Canadian, and Belgian flag there, and it's just a symbol that that battle took place in both those years. Highly worth visiting and stopping. Kind of gives you a sense of history where you are, where the war started and ended. For me, the most to visit is Saint-Cyprien Military Cemetery. There's only 2 Canadians in there. One of them is, of course, George Price. His grave is there. He also happens to be almost right beside a man named Lieutenant Dees. He was a Royal Fusilier. He was the first Victoria Cross recipient of the war. And in fact, he was killed not far from where George Price was killed in an action. And not far from him and around the corner at the cemetery is where John Parr is. And George Ellison is also there. It's a unique cemetery. It is one of the very few truly mixed cemeteries. Saint-Cyprien was built by the Germans in 1917. The land was donated by Belgium. It is very much built in the German tradition. So any of these from 1914, and there are a great many of them, are all from the opening battles of the British Army versus the Germans in the Race to the Sea and the Battle of Mons 1914. Some of them are in mass graves, and you can tell because the way the headstones are spaced around, which is a very common German burial practice and technique. Some of the original markers that were marking those mass graves are still in place. And it was very much built in the German style. After the war, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission said, that's really nice, we're taking over, pat, 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 kicked the German War Graves Commission out, and they didn't actually get access to it again until the 1970s, almost into the 1980s. And it is a mix of German-style headstones, which is very unique. There's about 5 different patterns of German headstones. And of course, all the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's ones. The book it's still listed as a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery, although now German War Graves Commission also their books there saying that the German War Graves Commission is not sponsored by a government, and so they're only by private donations. So they are more than willing to let the War Graves Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, look after it. But it's a really unique cemetery, and it's really worth seeing. So the other place you can go visit is the George Price Memorial. It's not far from where he was killed. The house he was killed at has been since taken down and destroyed. The original plaque has been moved, and now he has a memorial, and you can go visit that. And it's a pretty nice place. I visited George about 3 times. Last time was in March, and it's always very moving to go there to realize you were standing at the place where the war started and ended. So, of course, this was a massive undertaking, and millions of people were killed in the First World War. Over the course of the war, 619,636 men and women had joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force, of which 425,000 eventually served overseas. Of that total, 51,748 were killed in action or died of their wounds. 7,796 died of disease, injury, or accidents, making the total war dead for Canada 59,544. Was that joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. There were 172,950 who were wounded, taking the total casualties for the CEF to about 230,494, or about 37% of those who joined became a casualty in some way. It is estimated that about 3,000 Indigenous soldiers in the missionary force. The challenge is to find sometimes they figure it's about 3,000. 1,300 African or Caribbean Canadians joined the expeditionary force. Most served in construction battalions and labor units, but there were many that did see action in frontline battalions. About 200 Japanese Canadians enlisted. Some battalions were more willing to take them, like the 10th Battalion and the 52nd Battalion, and others were not, PPCLI being one of them that would ship them off all the time. And there was about 10 Indo-Pakistani Canadians that joined the CEF during the war. Of the CEF, 2,800 women enlisted, of which 2,500 served overseas, and of those 40 died, of which between 20 and 30 were killed in action or died of wounds or died because of enemy action. So, in total, Canada raised 260 numbered infantry battalions. Each battalion is supposed to be about 800 guys, but only 50 actually saw action in the 4 Canadian divisions. They raised 2 named infantry battalions, the PPCLI being the last privately raised unit, and of course the Royal Canadian Regiment. They raised 17 mounted regiments, including the Royal Canadian Dragoons, Lord Strathcona's Horse, Fort Garry Horse, the Canadian Light Horse, and all 17 battalion or units of the Canadian Mounted Rifles. They raised 13 battalions of railway troops, 5 pioneer battalions, including one that was predominantly Indigenous, the 107th, 4 divisional supply trains and units, 4 divisional signals companies, over a dozen engineering companies, 80 field and heavy artillery batteries, 15 field ambulances, 23 general and stationary hospitals, and many other specialist medical, dental, forestry, labor, tunneling, cyclist, and service units, and including 2 tank battalions. So what did Canada do? What was our participation, and what was the reward? Well, 70 Canadians were awarded the Victoria Cross for actions performed in the First World War. 739 officers received the Distinguished Service Order. Another of those, 88 received a bar, and 15 of them received 2 bars, so 3 times being awarded the DSO for their actions. For the soldiers, 2,132 received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, of which 38 won it a second time, and 1 won it a third time. And for the Air Force, 4,460 distinguished flying crosses were awarded, with 256 being awarded a second time and 6 winning it a third time. 3,727 officers won the Military Cross, with 324 of them receiving it the award a second time and another 18 winning it a third. For the non-commissioned members, 13,654 won the Military Medal, with 848 winning it a second time and 38 winning it a third time. And for the NCMs that were flying, 556 received the Distinguished Flying Medal, but none were awarded it a second time. The most active unit of the First World War was the 10th Canadians Battalion, today perpetuated by the Calgary Highlanders and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, who not only had the most awards, 2 Victoria Crosses, 14 Distinguished Service Orders with 3 bars and 1 second bar, 15 Military Crosses with 12 bars, 65 Distinguished Conduct Medals and 1 with a bar, 269 military medals with 21 bars and 1 with a second bar, 18 Meritorious Service Medals, which meant long service, good conduct, and you were a pretty good soldier, 83 mentions and dispatches, and 22 foreign decorations. And that battalion also had the most amount of awards for single action, which happened to be their action. They're fighting at Hill 70. The 16th Canadian Scottish Battalion, which today still exists as the Canadian Scottish, and was one of the units that stormed the beaches on D-Day in the opening attack, had the most Victoria Cross recipients with 4, and were the only unit in the Canadian Corps to have 2 Victoria Cross actions on the same day by members of the battalion. One was a private, and one was the commanding officer, and that was on the 2nd of September, 1918. And interestingly, both of them survived. 25 Canadians were executed for crimes during the war, 22 for desertion, 1 for cowardice, and 2 for murder, with the 22nd French Canadian Battalion having the most amount executed, which is 5. 1 Canadian Army Service Corps member was convicted and executed for the murder of his regimental sergeant major, and as happenstance would have it, they're buried 3 graves apart. The highest ranking Canadian killed in action was Major General Malcolm Mercer, commander of the 3rd Canadian Division, who died on the 2nd of June 1916 at the Battle of Mons. The first soldiers to fall for Canada were on the 1st of March 1915, which happened to be 5 members of the PPC Allied that were killed in action or died of wounds, and 1 soldier from the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion who died of his wounds. The last soldier to fall, of course, was Private George Price of the 28th Battalion on the 11th of November 1918. So Canada's contribution to the First World War was very significant. Many people have written about them after the war, calling them the shock army of the British Empire. That is very true because of the way they were built. And it is worth visiting these 2 battles because they're the very end. And most people have never heard of them. And it's unfortunate because it is probably the greatest achievement that we ended up where the war began. Thank you very much.
No, well, Rob, again, thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you sharing your knowledge with us. And do you want to give a plug to your session in June? Because I know that one is actually going to be coming up sooner than we usually do them towards the end of the month, but we have a special one coming up in June.
Yes. So on the 6th of June, it's the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which is a hugely significant day for Canada because the 3rd Canadian Division was one of the 7 divisions that stormed the beaches, and Canada had Juno Beach. And we're going to be talking about the storming of the beach and then the move inland, where Canada made the greatest advance on the 6th of June of any Allied units. And it's going to be an awesome time. It's going to be at 8 o'clock Berlin time on the 6th of June. And it's going to be an awesome talk because we're going to talk about the landing beaches. We're going to talk about move inland and the entire battle. Yes, I presented this battle before, but this is going to be a whole new presentation and version of it. And we're going to get into some little really nitty gritty micro actions. So it's going to be a really great time. And I recommend everybody come out to that one. It's a good way to commemorate it because if you try to go to France, good luck on getting onto the beaches.
Thank you so much, Rob. And just a reminder again, so it's going to be June 6th, and that's going to be 8 p.m. Berlin. So we're going to be starting an hour later than we usually start. And if you're not able to join us, don't worry, we will be recording it. And within a few days of the session, it should be posted online. So definitely look to register for that. So thank you so much, Rob. And we'll send out the video to anyone who registered for the session this evening. And when I send out that video, I will pop a link in for the registration for the session in June as well. So thanks again, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening.